Most people never realize they are caught in a trap because the trap does not look like danger at first. It looks like routine, familiarity, and even success. You wake up every day believing you are making choices, but in reality, many of those choices are shaped by invisible patterns you inherited from fear, past experiences, and emotional conditioning. The real danger is not the obvious failure everyone avoids, but the silent repetition of the same cycle that keeps you emotionally stuck while your outer life appears to move. You meet different people, change environments, try new plans, but something strangely familiar keeps repeating. Similar disappointments, similar frustrations, similar emotional outcomes. This is how the trap works. It does not stop you completely. It simply redirects you in circles so you never notice you are not truly progressing. Comfort becomes the disguise. You stay where things feel predictable, even when deep inside you know it no longer inspires growth. The mind convinces you that stability is safety, but in many cases that so-called stability is just stagnation wearing a calm face. You ignore small signals, intuition telling you something feels off, repeated thoughts that you are meant for more, emotional exhaustion that appears even when nothing big is wrong. Over time, these ignored signals become a pattern of delay in your life. Opportunities appear, but you hesitate. Decisions are needed, but you overthink. Change calls you, but fear edits your response every time. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to live inside a loop where potential is constantly postponed. The trap is powerful because it does not force you, it convinces you. It makes you believe you are still in control while quietly limiting how far you are willing to go. Breaking out of it requires something most people avoid: honesty with yourself. Not the surface-level kind, but the uncomfortable recognition that what feels safe is not always what is right for your growth. The moment you start questioning your repeated patterns instead of defending them, the illusion begins to weaken and a completely new awareness starts to open inside you. When everything in your life suddenly starts falling apart, the first instinct is to believe something has gone wrong, that you made a mistake, that people changed, or that life has become unfair toward you. But what most people never realize is that collapse is often not a sign of failure, it is a sign of forced evolution. Life does not always wait for you to be ready in a comfortable way. Sometimes it removes the very structures you were leaning on so you can finally see what was never stable to begin with. The job that ended, the relationship that broke, the opportunity that disappeared, these are not isolated events. They are part of a deeper rearrangement that you cannot fully understand in the moment, but will eventually recognize as necessary. What feels like sudden loss is often delayed truth surfacing all at once. You were holding on to things that looked right on the surface but were silently limiting your direction. The collapse is uncomfortable because it strips away identity layers you built your sense of security on, forcing you into a space where nothing feels familiar anymore. In that unfamiliar space, the mind panics because it cannot predict the outcome, but this is exactly where transformation begins. You are being pushed out of emotional dependence on what was never meant to carry your future. The discomfort is not random, it is recalibration. Life is breaking attachments that would have kept you repeating the same level of experience over and over again. And while it feels like everything is going backwards, what is actually happening is that you are being redirected away from a path that was slowly narrowing your potential. The breakdown is not asking you to quit life, it is asking you to stop trusting illusions of stability that no longer align with your growth. If you can remain aware instead of reacting in panic, you start to see that every ending is quietly making space for something you could not have received while holding on to the old structure. That silent phase you are going through right now is far more meaningful than it appears, even though on the surface it feels like nothing is happening. No messages, no clear progress, no visible change, just a strange stillness that makes you question whether you are stuck or forgotten. But silence in life is never empty. It is always loaded with preparation that you cannot yet see. When everything becomes quiet, it is often because external distractions are being removed, so your internal awareness can finally come forward. You are being separated from noise so you can hear what you've been ignoring for a long time, your own instincts, your deeper direction, the subtle truth you keep brushing aside when life is busy. This phase feels uncomfortable because the mind is addicted to movement and validation. It wants proof that something is happening, but transformation does not always announce itself in visible ways. Sometimes the most important shifts happen in unseen layers of thinking, perception, and emotional detachment. You may notice that things you once cared deeply about suddenly feel less important, or people you once depended on no longer hold the same emotional weight. This is not detachment without reason, it is realignment happening beneath awareness. Silence also exposes what was always inside you. When there is no external noise to blame or distract you, you are left alone with your thoughts, fears, and unresolved patterns. That is why this phase feels intense even when nothing physical is happening. It is forcing you to confront yourself without escape routes. And in that confrontation, clarity slowly begins to form. What once felt confusing starts to simplify. What once felt urgent starts to lose power over you. This is the hidden purpose of silence. It is not absence of progress, but the clearing of interference, so your next direction can be received without distortion. If you resist it, you will feel more lost. But if you observe it without panic, you will begin to notice that silence is actually preparing you for a level of understanding that noise could never allow you to reach. The most subtle and yet most powerful force keeping people stuck is not external limitation, it is attachment. Attachment is what quietly decides your direction long before you make conscious decisions. You may think you are choosing freely, but often you are just protecting what feels emotionally familiar. This includes people, situations, identities, and even pain patterns that you have learned to survive with. The dangerous part is that attachment rarely announces itself as something harmful. Instead, it feels like loyalty, comfort, love, or responsibility. But anything that refuses to evolve with you eventually begins to limit you. You stay connected to people who no longer align with your growth because the memory of who they once were still feels stronger than the reality of who they have become. You hold on to versions of yourself that were created during survival phases, even when those versions are no longer needed for your current path. And slowly, without realizing it, your life becomes divided between what is familiar and what is possible. But familiarity almost always wins when attachment is strong. This is why growth feels so uncomfortable, because growth demands release, and release feels like loss even when it is necessary. You are not just letting go of things, you are letting go of emotional identities that gave you a sense of security. That is why resistance shows up so strongly whenever change approaches. The mind tries to justify holding on by creating fear-based reasoning. What if I need this later? What if I am making a mistake? But what if I lose something important? But underneath those questions is a deeper truth. You are afraid of the unknown version of yourself that will emerge after release. Attachment keeps you anchored to the past, even when life is pulling you toward expansion. And the longer you stay attached, the more your decisions become influenced by fear of separation rather than alignment with truth. The real shift begins when you start recognizing that not everything you feel connected to is meant to continue with you. Some things are only meant to guide you to a certain point, not define your entire journey. When you begin to observe attachment instead of obeying it, you create space for clarity, and in that space, your direction slowly becomes lighter, clearer, and more aligned with who you are becoming instead of who you used to be. You are not actually stuck in the way it feels. You are in a timing process that your emotions are struggling to interpret. Human perception is trained to believe that if something is meant for you, it should arrive immediately, clearly, and without confusion. But real alignment does not follow emotional urgency. It follows precise timing that often feels delayed when viewed from a limited perspective. What you call waiting is often preparation in disguise. There are elements of your path that are still being adjusted, circumstances you cannot see, connections that have not fully formed, and internal shifts within you that must stabilize before the next stage can hold its weight. If everything arrived too early, you would not have the capacity to sustain it. That is why timing feels frustrating, because your desire is ahead of your readiness, and your awareness is catching up to your potential in stages. Meanwhile, what is leaving your life is not a punishment or rejection, it is filtration. Life removes what is misaligned not to empty your path, but to prevent overlap between your past patterns and your future direction. The mind interprets delay as denial, but in reality, delay is often protection from premature outcomes that would collapse under incomplete preparation. You may notice that certain opportunities almost happened but didn't, or certain people entered your life briefly and then disappeared. These are not random interruptions. They are alignment tests that reveal what is not meant to stay. The more you resist timing, the heavier the experience feels, because resistance creates emotional tension between where you are and where you want to be. But when you stop interpreting timing as failure, your perspective begins to shift. You start noticing that subtle progress has been happening all along, in your thinking, in your reactions, in your emotional awareness. What once triggered panic no longer affects you the same way. What once felt urgent now feels distant. This is how alignment quietly builds itself. You are not behind, you are being positioned. And what is coming toward you is not late, it is being refined so it can meet the version of you that is finally ready to receive it without breaking it apart. There reaches a point in every major shift of life where everything stops arguing with you and simply begins to change, whether you are ready or not. That moment is often misunderstood as collapse, but in reality, it is transition reaching its final stage. You are no longer being asked to decide whether to grow, you are being shown what happens when growth can no longer be postponed. The old structure of your life, your habits, attachments, assumptions, and emotional reflexes starts losing its influence not because you failed, but because it has completed its purpose. When that structure weakens, the mind tries to hold on by creating fear, confusion, and urgency, but those reactions are just the last signals of an identity that is dissolving. What feels like instability is actually reorganization at a deeper level. Life is not pulling things away to leave you empty, it is removing what cannot exist in the next version of you. And this is the part most people misinterpret. They assume loss means something went wrong, when in truth it often means something is being rewritten. The turning point comes when you stop negotiating with what is already changing and start observing it with awareness instead of resistance. Because resistance slows the process, but acceptance allows clarity to emerge faster. In this stage, you begin to notice something important. Your reactions are changing before your circumstances do. You respond differently to the same situations, you feel less attached to outcomes that once controlled you, and your emotional intensity begins to stabilize even in uncertainty. This is not random. It is internal alignment catching up with external change. The moment everything changes is rarely dramatic in the way people expect. It is often quiet, almost unnoticeable, until one day you realize you are no longer the same person who feared the collapse in the first place. And in that realization, the entire experience reveals its meaning, not as destruction, but as transformation that was always guiding you toward a version of life you could not have reached while staying the same. So now step back and look at everything you've just understood, not as separate ideas, but as one continuous truth unfolding in your life. The trap was never a single event, it was the cycle you kept repeating without awareness. The collapse was never punishment, it was structure being removed because it could no longer hold your next level. The silence was never emptiness, it was preparation, clearing noise so you could finally hear yourself again. The attachment was never safety, it was the invisible chain keeping you tied to versions of life that were already finished. And the timing you called delay was never against you, it was alignment working in a way your emotions couldn't immediately interpret. When you connect all of this, a deeper realization appears. Nothing has been randomly breaking, everything has been intelligently rearranging. What feels like confusion was actually correction. What felt like loss was actually redirection. And what felt like distance from your desired life was actually space being created so something more aligned could enter without distortion. You were never being pushed away from your path. You were being pulled out of everything that would have kept you repeating it at a lower level. The hardest part was never the change itself, but the resistance to understanding why the change was necessary. And here is the turning point you were being led to all along. The moment you stop interpreting your life through fear, you start seeing it through awareness. In that awareness, you no longer panic at endings because you recognize them as transitions. You no longer cling to what is leaving because you understand it cannot go forward with you. And you no longer doubt your direction because you can finally see that even the chaos was shaping you. This is where everything shifts. Not because the world suddenly becomes perfect, but because you stop resisting the process that was already rebuilding you from within. And in that realization, your old life doesn't just end. It quietly makes room for the life that was waiting on the other side of your understanding. So now step back and look at everything you've just understood, not as separate ideas, but as one continuous truth unfolding in your life. The trap was never a single event, it was the cycle you kept repeating without awareness. The collapse was never punishment, it was structure being removed because it could no longer hold your next level. The silence was never emptiness. It was preparation, clearing noise so you could finally hear yourself again. The attachment was never safety, it was the invisible chain keeping you tied to versions of life that were already finished. And the timing you called delay was never against you, it was alignment working in a way your emotions couldn't immediately interpret. When you connect all of this, a deeper realization appears. Nothing has been randomly breaking, everything has been intelligently rearranging. What feels like confusion was actually correction. What felt like loss was actually redirection. And what felt like distance from your desired life was actually space being created so something more aligned could enter without distortion. You were never being pushed away from your path. You were being pulled out of everything that would have kept you repeating it at a lower level. The hardest part was never the change itself, but the resistance to understanding why the change was necessary. And here is the turning point you were being led to all along. The moment you stop interpreting your life through fear, you start seeing it through awareness. In that awareness, you no longer panic at endings because you recognize them as transitions. You no longer cling to what is leaving because you understand it cannot go forward with you. And you no longer doubt your direction because you can finally see that even the chaos was shaping you. This is where everything shifts. Not because the world suddenly becomes perfect, but because you stop resisting the process that was already rebuilding you from within. And in that realization, your old life doesn't just end. It quietly makes room for the life that was waiting on the other side of your understanding.